Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where the autumn mist clings to jagged cliffs like forgotten memories, there exists a cave that most hikers would never notice. Hidden behind a curtain of wild blackberry vines and weathered granite, this wasn't just any cave. It was home to someone who had chosen to disappear from the world entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Rebecca Thornfield, though she hadn't heard anyone speak it aloud in over 3 years. At 28, she moved through the shadows of her rocky shelter with the careful precision of someone who had learned to survive on instinct alone. Her dark hair, now reaching past her shoulders, was braided with small twigs and leaves, not from any fashion choice, but from necessity. Living so close to nature meant becoming part of it. The cave itself stretched back nearly 40 feet into the mountainside. Rebecca had discovered it during what she now thought of as the running time, those desperate weeks when she fled from everything familiar, seeking a place where human voices couldn't reach her. The entrance was narrow enough that she had to turn sideways to slip through, but inside, the space opened into a surprisingly livable area. Natural shelves in the rock held her few possessions: a dented metal cup, several glass jars filled with preserved berries, a worn wool blanket that had once been navy blue, but now appeared more gray than anything else. She had arranged smooth stones into a circle near the cave mouth, creating a fire pit that she used sparingly. Smoke meant detection, and detection meant people, and people meant the kind of pain she had fled from in the first place. Most of her meals consisted of wild berries, edible roots she had learned to identify through trial and error, and occasionally small fish she could catch with her bare hands from the creek that wound through the valley below. The morning routine never varied. Rebecca would wake with the first hint of dawn filtering through the vine curtain, her body automatically responding to the rhythm she had established. She would lie still for several minutes, listening, always listening. The forest had its own language: the rustle of a deer moving through underbrush, the warning call of a jay spotting a predator, the difference between wind through pine needles and wind through aspen leaves. These sounds had become more familiar to her than any human conversation. After confirming that the world beyond her cave remained as empty of people as she preferred, Rebecca would slip outside to tend to her water collection system. She had positioned several containers at strategic points where rainwater would gather, and had even managed to create a rudimentary filter using layers of sand, charcoal, and clean cloth. It wasn't perfect, but it kept her alive, and alive was enough. Her clothes told the story of someone who had once lived a very different life. The fabric of her pants, though now patched and faded, had once been expensive denim. Her boots, scuffed and resoled with strips of rubber she had found, bore the mark of a high-end outdoor brand. Most telling was the small silver locket that hung around her neck, carefully hidden beneath layers of worn clothing. Inside was a photograph so faded that the faces were barely recognizable, but Rebecca knew every detail by heart. The physical transformation was obvious to anyone who might have known her before. Where once she had been soft from a life spent mostly indoors, now her arms showed the lean muscle of someone who climbed, carried, and built everything by hand. Her skin, despite her efforts to stay shaded, had been weathered by mountain sun and wind. Her hands, which had once been manicured and soft, now bore the calluses and small scars of someone who worked with stone and wood and the unforgiving elements of nature. But the deeper changes were in her movements, her awareness, her entire relationship with the world around her. Rebecca moved like someone who had learned that safety existed only in the spaces between being seen. She placed each step deliberately, testing the ground before committing her full weight. When she gathered food, she took only what she needed, leaving the rest to ensure the plants would continue to provide. She had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the wildlife around her, knowing which creatures were simply going about their business and which ones might signal the approach of something or someone that didn't belong. Loneliness was a living thing. It sat with her during meals, accompanied her on her careful walks through the forest, and whispered to her during the long mountain nights when the wind howled through the rocks above her cave. Sometimes she would catch herself starting to speak aloud, then stop abruptly, the sound of her own voice startling in the endless quiet. She had learned to distinguish between the loneliness that ached and the loneliness that protected. The first kind made her want to walk down the mountain toward the distant lights she could sometimes see twinkling in the valley. The second kind reminded her why she had climbed up here in the first place. Winter was approaching, and Rebecca could feel it in the way the air moved differently through the trees, in the behavior of the animals around her, in the angle of the sun as it traced its daily path across the sky. This would be her fourth winter in the cave, and each one had tested her in ways she couldn't have imagined during her previous life. The first winter had nearly killed her. She had been unprepared for the savage cold, the way snow could block her entrance for days at a time, the challenge of staying warm when every piece of wood had to be gathered and stored in secret. But she had learned. The cave was now better equipped with carefully hoarded supplies. She had discovered which parts of the interior retained heat most effectively and had arranged her living space accordingly. Along the back wall, she had built a crude but functional storage system using flat rocks and salvaged pieces of wood. Here she kept her winter supplies: dried berries, smoked fish wrapped in leaves, pine needle tea that helped ward off the worst of the cold weather illnesses. Her days were measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the tasks necessary for survival. There was the morning water check, the careful exploration of the immediate area for food or useful materials, the ongoing maintenance of her shelter and supplies. In the afternoons when the sun was highest, she would sometimes venture farther from the cave, always moving with extreme caution, always ready to disappear at the first sign of human presence. She had memorized every trail within a 2-mile radius of her cave. She knew which paths were used by hikers and hunters, and which ones existed only for the wildlife. She had mapped every hiding spot, every vantage point, every route that would allow her to move unseen. This knowledge had become as essential to her as breathing. The few times she had encountered other people during her 3 years on the mountain, Rebecca had perfected the art of becoming invisible. She could freeze so completely that even her breathing seemed to stop, allowing hikers to pass within yards of her position without ever knowing she was there. Once, a family with young children had stopped to rest less than 50 feet from her cave entrance. She had remained motionless inside for over 4 hours, listening to their laughter and conversation, feeling something twist painfully in her chest as she remembered what it felt like to be part of that kind of easy, trusting human connection. But the memory that followed that longing always brought her back to reality. She remembered why trust had become impossible, why the sound of voices now made her heart race with fear rather than hope, why the safest place she could imagine was a cave where no one would ever think to look for her. The animals had become her only companions. A family of chipmunks had taken up residence in the rocks near her cave entrance, and though they remained wary, they had grown accustomed to her presence. She had learned to recognize individual birds by their calls and flight patterns. A red-tailed hawk that hunted in the valley below had become a kind of early warning system when it cried out in a particular way. She knew someone was approaching from that direction. Most remarkable was her relationship with an old mountain doe that she had encountered during her second winter. The deer had appeared one morning when Rebecca was gathering ice to melt for water, and instead of bolting at the sight of her, it had simply stood and watched. Over time, they had developed a strange mutual acceptance. The doe would sometimes graze near the cave entrance while Rebecca worked, and Rebecca had learned to interpret the deer's behavior as another layer of security. When the doe was calm, the mountain was safe. When she was alert or absent, Rebecca knew to be extra cautious. These animal relationships were the closest thing to friendship Rebecca had experienced in years, and she treasured them precisely because they asked nothing of her beyond the basic respect that comes from sharing the same difficult environment. There were no words to misinterpret, no promises to break, no trust to be betrayed. There was simply the mutual understanding of creatures who had learned to survive in a place that demanded everything and forgave nothing. As autumn deepened and the first frost began to silver the morning grass, Rebecca felt the familiar tension that came with the changing seasons. Winter preparations required her to venture farther from the cave, to take greater risks in gathering the supplies she would need. It was during these necessary expeditions that she felt most vulnerable, most aware of how completely she had separated herself from the human world that still existed in the valleys below. But it was also during these preparations that something unexpected was beginning to stir in the lower meadows, something that would soon change everything about the careful, isolated life she had built in the shadows of the Colorado mountains. 3 years and 8 months earlier, Rebecca Thornfield had been living a completely different life in the bustling city of Denver. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized tech company, lived in a modern apartment in the trendy Highland neighborhood, and had what everyone around her considered a perfect relationship with Marcus Hartwell, a successful real estate developer who seemed to check every box on the list of desirable partners. Her apartment on West 32nd Avenue was everything she had dreamed of during her college years. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and she had spent months carefully decorating each room with pieces that reflected her personality. Vibrant paintings from local artists, houseplants that thrived in the abundant natural light, and a collection of vintage books she had gathered from estate sales throughout the city. The space felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could unwind from the demanding pace of corporate life and plan for the future she was building with Marcus. Rebecca had grown up in the small town of Steamboat Springs, raised by her grandmother, Eleanor, after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Eleanor Thornfield was a retired schoolteacher who had instilled in Rebecca both a love of learning and an unshakable belief that hard work and kindness would always be rewarded. The small mountain community had wrapped around Rebecca like a protective embrace during those difficult teenage years, and everyone from the postal worker to the grocery store owner had played a role in raising her. Eleanor had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia during Rebecca's senior year of college, and Rebecca had spent every weekend and holiday caring for her grandmother while finishing her degree in communications. When Eleanor passed away 2 years later, she left Rebecca the small house in Steamboat Springs and enough money to make a fresh start wherever she chose. Rebecca had decided on Denver, drawn by the city's proximity to the mountains that had shaped her childhood, and the promise of career opportunities that simply didn't exist in smaller towns. The transition to city life had been challenging at first. Rebecca was naturally introverted, more comfortable with small groups and intimate conversations than the networking events and social gatherings that seemed to dominate Denver's professional scene. But she had gradually found her footing, making friends through her work and developing a routine that balanced her career ambitions with weekend trips back to the mountains she loved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus had entered her life during her second year in Denver. They met at a charity fundraiser for urban development, where Rebecca was representing her company's community outreach initiatives. Marcus was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room, tall, confident, impeccably dressed, and possessing the kind of charisma that made people want to be near him. He had approached Rebecca during the cocktail hour, complimenting her company's environmental initiatives and asking thoughtful questions about sustainable development practices. Their first conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours, and Rebecca had been impressed by Marcus's apparent passion for creating positive change through his work. He spoke eloquently about his vision for developing properties that would strengthen communities rather than displace them, and he seemed genuinely interested in Rebecca's perspective on corporate social responsibility. When he asked for her number, she had given it willingly, excited by the prospect of dating someone who shared her values and ambitions. The early months of their relationship had felt like a fairy tale. Marcus was attentive, generous, and eager to introduce Rebecca to his world of upscale restaurants, weekend trips to Aspen, and social events with Denver's business elite. He seemed proud to have her on his arm, often praising her intelligence and insight to his friends and colleagues. Rebecca, who had always been somewhat self-conscious about her small-town background, found herself blossoming under his attention and approval. Marcus had a way of making grand gestures that swept Rebecca off her feet. He once surprised her with a weekend trip to Paris after she mentioned wanting to visit the Louvre. He had her apartment filled with roses on her birthday, and he regularly left expensive gifts at her office jewelry, designer handbags, and once a vintage edition of her favorite book that must have cost hundreds of dollars. To Rebecca, these gestures felt like proof of a love so deep that it demanded expression through extravagant acts of devotion. Looking back, Rebecca could see the warning signs that she had missed at the time. Marcus had strong opinions about almost everything, and he had a way of presenting his preferences as obvious truths that any reasonable person would share. When Rebecca expressed interest in taking a ceramics class, Marcus had laughed and suggested she might prefer wine tasting, instead something more sophisticated and social. When she wanted to spend a weekend camping in Rocky Mountain National Park, he convinced her that a spa retreat in Vail would be more relaxing and romantic. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Rebecca found herself deferring to Marcus's judgment on more and more aspects of her life. He helped her choose a new wardrobe that better reflected her potential, as he put it. He suggested she might be happier in a different apartment, one in his building, where they could spend more time together. He encouraged her to be more selective about her friendships, pointing out that some of her colleagues were holding her back professionally with their negative attitudes and limited ambitions. The changes felt voluntary at first. Marcus never demanded anything. He simply offered suggestions and observations that seemed to come from a place of love and concern for her well-being. When Rebecca expressed uncertainty about any of his recommendations, he would reassure her that he only wanted what was best for her, that he could see her potential more clearly than she could see it herself. The first crack in Rebecca's perception of their relationship came during a dinner party at Marcus's penthouse apartment. She had been telling a story about her grandmother's unconventional teaching methods when Marcus interrupted with a laugh, saying, "Rebecca always exaggerates these small-town stories. I think her grandmother was probably just a regular teacher who got creative out of boredom." The comment had been delivered with a smile, as if it were good-natured teasing, but Rebecca had felt something cold settle in her stomach as the other guests laughed along. Later that evening, when Rebecca tried to talk to Marcus about how his comment had made her feel, he had seemed genuinely confused by her reaction. He explained that he was just trying to help her understand how her stories might sound to people who didn't know her background, that he was actually protecting her from potential embarrassment. His explanation was so reasonable, delivered with such apparent concern for her feelings, that Rebecca found herself apologizing for being overly sensitive. This pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency over the following months. Marcus would make subtle corrections to Rebecca's behavior, appearance, or conversation, always framing his feedback as helpful guidance from someone who understood the social dynamics she was still learning to navigate. When Rebecca felt hurt or confused by his corrections, Marcus would express surprise at her reaction, then patiently explain why his perspective was more accurate than her emotional response. The isolation began so gradually that Rebecca didn't recognize it as deliberate. Marcus would express concern about certain friends who seemed to be influencing Rebecca negatively, or he would schedule romantic getaways during weekends when Rebecca had planned to visit college friends. He never forbade her from maintaining these relationships, but he created an environment where choosing her friends felt like choosing against him, and the consequences of that choice were made clear through his disappointment and withdrawal of affection. Rebecca's work performance began to suffer as she became increasingly preoccupied with navigating the complex emotional landscape of her relationship. She would spend hours analyzing conversations with Marcus, trying to understand why interactions that should have been simple expressions of love or support left her feeling anxious and uncertain. She began to doubt her own perceptions, her own memories, her own judgment about even the most basic aspects of her daily life. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March. Rebecca had received news that her best friend from college, Sarah Mitchell, was getting married and wanted Rebecca to be her maid of honor. The wedding was planned for a weekend when Marcus had already scheduled a business trip to Los Angeles, and he had invited Rebecca to join him. When Rebecca explained that she needed to attend Sarah's wedding instead, Marcus's reaction was unlike anything she had experienced before. His initial response was calm, almost patronizing. He reminded Rebecca that Sarah had been consistently negative about their relationship, that Sarah was probably jealous of Rebecca's happiness and success, and that choosing Sarah's wedding over a significant business opportunity showed poor judgment about priorities. When Rebecca insisted that she couldn't miss her best friend's wedding, Marcus's demeanor shifted completely. The argument that followed revealed a side of Marcus that Rebecca had never seen before. His voice remained controlled, but his words became surgical in their precision, targeting every insecurity and vulnerability that Rebecca had ever shared with him. He told her that her loyalty to small-town friends was holding her back from the sophisticated life she claimed to want. He suggested that her inability to make rational decisions about relationships was probably why she had struggled to maintain friendships in Denver. He questioned whether she truly understood what it meant to be in a committed adult relationship. Given her limited experience with serious partners, the attack was devastating precisely because it was delivered with such apparent calm and logic. Marcus never raised his voice, never used profanity, never made threats. He simply dismantled Rebecca's sense of self with the methodical precision of someone who had been studying her weaknesses for months. When Rebecca began to cry, he expressed disappointment at her emotional reaction, suggesting that her tendency to become hysterical when faced with reasonable feedback was something she might want to address with professional help. Rebecca attended Sarah's wedding, but the weekend was overshadowed by her confusion and pain about the fight with Marcus. She found herself unable to fully enjoy the celebration, constantly checking her phone for messages from him and rehearsing the apology she would offer when she returned to Denver. Sarah noticed Rebecca's distraction and tried to talk to her about it, but Rebecca found herself defending Marcus and minimizing the significance of their argument. When Rebecca returned from the wedding, Marcus was waiting for her with flowers and a heartfelt apology. He explained that he had been under tremendous pressure at work and had taken his stress out on her unfairly. He acknowledged that he had said things he didn't mean and promised to work on managing his emotions better in the future. The apology felt like a lifeline to Rebecca, who had spent the weekend terrified that she had lost the most important relationship in her life. But the pattern had been established. Over the following months, the cycles of criticism, emotional withdrawal, and tearful reconciliation became the rhythm of their relationship. Rebecca found herself walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring her own behavior and anticipating Marcus's reactions. She began to lose touch with her own preferences and opinions, automatically deferring to his judgment on everything from restaurant choices to career decisions. The final incident occurred on a cold February evening, exactly 1 year after their first major fight. Rebecca had been offered a promotion at work that would require her to travel frequently to the company's satellite offices in smaller Colorado towns. She was excited about the opportunity, which would allow her to combine her professional skills with her love of rural communities and small-town connections. When she told Marcus about the promotion over dinner, His reaction was immediate and devastating. He explained with perfect logic and apparent concern why accepting the position would be a mistake that would ultimately destroy both her career prospects and their relationship. He painted a detailed picture of how the travel would isolate her from Denver's professional networks, how working with small-town clients would limit her growth potential, and how the stress of constant travel would damage her health and their ability to build a future together. But this time, something was different. As Marcus spoke, Rebecca found herself remembering conversations with her grandmother about recognizing the difference between people who supported your dreams and people who diminished them. She thought about Sarah's wedding, about the joy and authenticity she had felt among friends who celebrated her exactly as she was. She realized that she couldn't remember the last time Marcus had expressed genuine enthusiasm for anything that mattered to her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was in love with someone who was systematically destroying everything that made her who she was. The recognition was so clear and so devastating that she excused herself from the restaurant and walked home alone through the snowy streets of Denver, feeling as though she were seeing her life clearly for the first time in months. That night, while Marcus was at his own apartment, Rebecca began to pack. She didn't have a plan beyond the desperate need to escape before she lost any more of herself to a relationship that was slowly erasing her existence. She packed only the essentials: clothes, important documents, the few personal items that Marcus hadn't already convinced her to replace with his preferred alternatives. The locket around her neck contained the last photograph ever taken of her with her grandmother Eleanor. It was the only thing of real value she took with her when she walked out of her Denver apartment at 3 in the morning, carrying a single backpack and driving toward the mountains where she had learned, as a child, that sometimes the safest place to be was far away from the people who claimed to love you. Thomas Brennan had been running his cattle ranch in the Copper Valley for 15 years, but he had never seen anything quite like the tracks he discovered that October morning near his northern fence line. They were human footprints, but they told a story that didn't make sense according to any normal understanding of how people moved through the wilderness. The prints were small, clearly made by a woman's boot, but they followed patterns that suggested someone who was actively avoiding detection. Instead of taking the obvious path along the creek bed, the tracks wove through the most difficult terrain, over rocky outcroppings, through dense thickets of scrub oak, along ridges that would be nearly invisible from the valley floor. Most telling of all, the prints appeared and disappeared, and disappears that their maker was using techniques typically employed by wildlife rather than humans. Thomas was a man who noticed details. At 42, he had spent most of his adult life reading the subtle signs that told him about the health of his land, the behavior of his cattle, and the presence of predators or other threats to his operation. He could tell from the depth and spacing of the tracks that this person was carrying very little weight, moving with extreme caution, and had been using this route regularly for an extended period of time. The Brennan Ranch covered nearly 8,000 acres of some of the most challenging terrain in the Colorado Rockies. Thomas had inherited the land from his uncle Patrick, who had spent 40 years building the operation from a small homestead into a sustainable cattle ranch that worked in harmony with the natural environment. Unlike the large corporate operations that had moved into other parts of Colorado, the Brennan Ranch focused on raising grass-fed cattle using traditional methods that required intimate knowledge of the land and weather patterns. Thomas lived alone in the ranch house his uncle had built, a sprawling log structure that commanded a view of the entire valley. He had been married once to a woman named Jennifer who had grown up in Denver and had romantic ideas about ranch life that didn't survive the reality of isolation, hard physical work, and the kind of self-reliance that mountain living demanded. The divorce had been amicable, but it had left Thomas with a deep understanding of how difficult it could be for people to adapt to life in such a remote and demanding environment. The ranch employed 3 full-time hands, Miguel Santos, who had been working the land for nearly 20 years, his son Carlos, who had grown up helping with the cattle and had developed into one of the most skilled horsemen Thomas had ever seen, and Janet Morrison, a tough-as-nails woman in her 50s who served as both the ranch foreman and the closest thing Thomas had to family. All 3 lived in smaller houses scattered across the property, and all 3 had noticed the strange signs that had been appearing around the ranch's perimeter over the past few months. There had been other evidence beyond the footprints. Miguel had found small campsites in remote areas so carefully concealed that they were almost invisible, but unmistakably human in origin. Carlos had discovered caches of gathered berries and roots that had been hidden in natural rock formations. Janet had noted that certain wild edible plants in the high meadows were being harvested with an expertise that suggested advanced knowledge of wilderness survival. Most intriguing of all was the evidence of someone who was actively helping the ranch's ecosystem thrive. Damaged fencing had been repaired with materials that clearly hadn't come from the ranch's supply shed. A beaver dam that had been threatening to flood one of the grazing areas had been modified with such skill that it now controlled water flow perfectly while maintaining the beaver's habitat. Someone had even been clearing invasive plant species from sensitive areas, doing the work with a precision that suggested deep understanding of the local ecology. Thomas had initially assumed they were dealing with an experienced outdoorsman who was using the ranch's remote areas for extended camping trips. But the more evidence he gathered, the more convinced he became that someone was actually living on or near his land permanently. The pattern of activity suggested year-round habitation, not seasonal camping. The level of environmental knowledge demonstrated by the land management activities suggested someone with either professional training or years of intimate experience with this specific ecosystem. What concerned Thomas most was the obvious effort being made to avoid any contact with him or his employees. In his experience, people who went to such lengths to remain hidden were usually running from something, and that something was often dangerous to everyone involved. He had known ranchers in other parts of Colorado who had discovered fugitives living on their land, and those situations had rarely ended well for anyone. But there was something about this particular situation that didn't fit the profile of a typical fugitive. The environmental stewardship, the careful repairs to ranch infrastructure, the obvious effort to remain completely self-sufficient. These weren't the actions of someone who posed a threat to the ranch or its operations. If anything, this mysterious person seemed to be actively contributing to the health and sustainability of the land. Thomas had spent weeks debating whether to involve law enforcement. His natural inclination was to handle the situation himself, but he also recognized that his judgment might be compromised by curiosity about someone who clearly possessed exceptional wilderness skills. He had grown up on this land, had learned tracking and survival techniques from his Uncle Patrick, and had always prided himself on being able to read the story that the land told about everything that moved across it. The idea that someone had been living practically next door to him for months without his knowledge was both humbling and fascinating. The decision to make contact came after Thomas discovered evidence of a serious problem that his mysterious neighbor had been dealing with alone. During a routine check of his cattle in the high pastures, he had found clear signs that a mountain lion had been hunting in the area. The tracks were fresh, and the lion appeared to be an old male who had been pushed out of his normal territory by younger, stronger cats. These displaced older lions were often the most dangerous to both livestock and humans because they were more likely to take risks and hunt prey they might normally avoid. Even more concerning was the evidence that the lion had already made several attempts to approach the area where Thomas believed his mysterious neighbor was living. The cat's tracks intersected with the human tracks in several locations, and the pattern of movement suggested that the lion was actively stalking someone. Thomas realized that whoever was living on his land might not be aware of the immediate danger they were in. The moral dilemma was clear. Thomas could continue to respect this person's obvious desire for privacy, but doing so might mean allowing someone to be killed by a predator. His conscience and his responsibility as a landowner demanded that he at least try to warn them about the lion. Even if they chose to ignore his warning, Thomas began his search. At dawn on a crisp October morning, when the first snow of the season had dusted the high peaks, he had decided to approach the area where he believed his neighbor was living, but to do so in a way that would minimize the sense of threat or invasion. Instead of tracking the person directly, he planned to make his presence known gradually, leaving clear signs of his approach and his peaceful intentions. He started by following the creek that ran through the valley floor, moving slowly and making enough noise to alert any wildlife to his presence. Thomas had learned long ago that the key to moving safely through predator territory was to avoid surprising anything that might react defensively. He stopped frequently to examine tracks and sign, building a mental map of the recent activity. In the area, the breakthrough came when Thomas discovered a set of tracks that told a story of immediate danger. The mountain lion had been following the same route he was taking, and the timestamps indicated that the encounter had happened within the last few hours. The human track showed a sudden change in pattern from the careful, measured steps of routine travel to the longer, more urgent strides of someone who had realized they were being followed. Thomas quickened his pace, following the tracks as they led up a steep slope toward a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide good defensive positions. The story written in the dirt and snow became increasingly dramatic as he climbed. The lion had given up its stalk at some point, probably deterred by the difficult terrain and the human's obvious awareness of its presence, but the track showed that the confrontation had been close enough to be genuinely dangerous. Near the top of the ridge, Thomas found something that made his heart race. A single drop of blood on a flat rock, surrounded by signs of a struggle. The human track showed a stumble, a fall, and then a rapid retreat toward what appeared to be a narrow opening in the rock face. The lion's track circled the area but didn't follow the human into what was obviously some kind of shelter. Thomas approached the opening carefully, calling out in a voice that he hoped sounded more reassuring than threatening. "Hello, I'm Thomas Brennan. I own the ranch in the valley. I've been tracking a mountain lion, and I think you might be in danger. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas began to wonder if he had misread the sign. But then he heard something that made his chest tighten with understanding. It was the sound of someone trying to control their breathing, the kind of careful, measured breathing that people do when they're trying to remain hidden while fighting off panic. "I know you're there," Thomas said gently, "and I know you don't want to be found. But there's an old tom lion hunting in this area, and he's been following your tracks. I've been ranching this land for 15 years, and I've never seen a cat behave this aggressively toward a human. You're not safe up here alone." Another long silence, then a voice so quiet Thomas almost missed it. "Go away." The voice was unmistakably female, but it carried an edge of desperation that made Thomas's heart ache. This wasn't the voice of someone who was choosing to live in isolation. This was the voice of someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance and was clinging to the only safety they had been able to find. "I'll go away," Thomas said, settling down on a rock about 20 feet from the cave entrance. "But first, I want you to know that the lion left tracks all around this area. He's been hunting here regularly, and sooner or later, he's going to find a way to get to you. You've done an amazing job surviving up here, but you can't fight off a mountain lion with your bare hands." Thomas waited, listening to the wind move through the rocks and the distant sound of his own cattle moving through the valley below. He had dealt with frightened animals countless times, and he recognized that this situation required the same kind of patience and careful approach that he would use with a wild horse that had been mistreated. "I'm going to leave some supplies here," he finally said. "Food, water, and some equipment that might help you deal with the lion if you encounter it again. I'm also going to leave you a radio so you can contact me if you need help. You don't have to use it, but it'll be there if you change your mind." Thomas stood up slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. "I'll come back in a few days to check on the lion situation. If you're still here, we can talk about options. If you're not, I'll understand. But I hope you'll consider that there are people who might be able to help you without forcing you to go back to whatever you're running from." As Thomas walked away from the cave, he heard the sound he had been hoping for, the slight scrape of movement from inside the rocky shelter. Someone was listening, and someone was alive. For the first time in months, Thomas felt genuinely hopeful about something that had nothing to do with cattle prices or weather patterns. The encounter had lasted less than 30 minutes, but Thomas knew that it had changed everything. He had found someone who needed help, someone who was clearly running from something terrible enough to make a cave seem like a reasonable alternative to civilization. More importantly, he had found someone whose survival skills and environmental knowledge had impressed him, despite their obvious desperation. As Thomas made his way back down the mountain toward his ranch house, he was already planning his next move. The mountain lion was a real threat that needed to be dealt with immediately, but the human element of the situation was far more complex. He had encountered someone who was clearly intelligent, resourceful, and skilled, but who had been pushed to the very edges of human endurance. Thomas Brennan had spent his entire adult life working with damaged things, injured animals, broken equipment, land that had been overgrazed or neglected. He had learned that healing required patience, consistency, and the kind of trust that could only be built through repeated demonstrations of good intentions. He had no idea what had driven this woman to choose isolation over human contact, but he was determined to show her that not all human contact had to be threatening. The real work was just beginning. Rebecca stared at the supplies. Thomas had left outside her cave for 3 days before she dared to touch them. The items sat there like some kind of test, challenging everything she had learned about survival in the years since she had fled from Denver. A canvas bag containing canned food, bottled water, emergency flares, and a two-way radio represented the first direct human contact she had experienced since choosing isolation over the possibility of being hurt again. Her initial reaction had been pure panic. After Thomas left that first day, Rebecca had spent hours pacing the confines of her cave, her mind racing through all the possible implications of being discovered. Would he bring others? Would he report her location to authorities? Was this the beginning of the end of the fragile safety she had built for herself in the mountains? The questions churned in her mind like a physical sickness, bringing back all the anxiety and hypervigilance that had driven her to this place. But as the hours passed and no one else appeared, Rebecca began to analyze what had actually happened during their brief encounter. Thomas had approached her hiding place carefully, had spoken in calm tones, and had left without trying to force her out or demanding explanations. Most importantly, he had identified a real threat, the mountain lion that she had been trying to handle alone with inadequate resources. The truth was that Rebecca had been aware of the lion for weeks. She had seen its tracks, had caught glimpses of its silhouette moving through the trees at dawn and dusk, and had felt the particular kind of alertness that comes from being watched by a predator. She had modified her routines to minimize exposure, had reinforced the entrance to her cave with additional barriers, and had armed herself with the improvised weapons she could create from rocks and sharpened sticks. But she also knew that her defenses were insufficient against a determined mountain lion, especially one that appeared to be actively hunting in her area. The radio crackled to life on the third evening after Thomas's visit, startling Rebecca so badly that she dropped the water bottle she had been drinking from. Thomas's voice came through the static, calm and undemanding. "Rebecca, if that's your name, this is Thomas. I wanted you to know that I tracked the lion today, and it's moved into the area just north of where you're staying. I'm going to be hunting it tomorrow morning, and I thought you should know in case you hear gunshots. I'll try to approach from the valley side so I don't disturb your location, but I wanted to give you advance warning." Rebecca held the radio in trembling hands, unsure whether to respond. The fact that Thomas knew her name was deeply unsettling. It meant he had been asking questions, investigating her background, possibly preparing to turn her over to people who would force her to return to a life she couldn't face. But his tone suggested nothing more threatening than practical concern for her safety. The internal debate that followed consumed most of the night. Rebecca's rational mind recognized that Thomas was offering help with a problem she couldn't solve alone. The mountain lion represented a threat to her physical survival that was immediate and concrete. But her emotional survival depended on maintaining the isolation that had protected her from the kind of psychological damage that human relationships could inflict. The sound of gunshots the next morning resolved the debate for her. 3 sharp cracks echoed through the valley, followed by silence that seemed to stretch for hours. Rebecca spent the day listening for any sound that might indicate the outcome of Thomas's hunt, alternating between relief that someone was addressing the lion threat and anxiety about what his success or failure might mean for her own situation. Late in the afternoon, the radio crackled again. "The lion's gone," Thomas's voice reported. "I tracked it to the ridge above Copper Creek, and it won't be bothering anyone anymore. I'm leaving some fresh supplies at the usual spot, including meat from the lion if you're interested. Mountain lion isn't bad eating if you know how to prepare it, and I figured you might appreciate the protein." The offer of lion meat struck Rebecca as both practical and deeply symbolic. Thomas was offering her the flesh of the predator that had threatened her, transformed from a source of fear into sustenance. It was exactly the kind of gesture that someone who truly understood wilderness survival would make, and it suggested a level of respect for her capabilities that Rebecca hadn't experienced from another human being in years. Over the following weeks, a strange routine developed. Thomas would leave supplies periodically, always accompanied by brief radio messages that provided information about weather conditions, wildlife activity, or practical advice about surviving the approaching winter. Rebecca would take the supplies, use what she needed, and carefully preserve the rest. She never responded to the radio messages, but she began to listen for them with something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. The communication was entirely one-sided, but it carried an emotional weight that grew stronger with each exchange. Thomas's messages revealed a person who paid attention to details, who understood the challenges of mountain living, and who seemed to respect Rebecca's autonomy even as he offered assistance. He never asked personal questions, never demanded responses, and never suggested that she should change her living situation. But he also never let her forget that he was there, that he was aware of her situation, and that help was available if she chose to accept it. The first major test of this delicate balance came with the arrival of early winter storms. Rebecca had survived 3 winters in the cave, but each one had pushed her to the absolute limits of her endurance and resourcefulness. This winter promised to be particularly harsh, with weather patterns that suggested heavy snowfall and extended periods of sub-zero temperatures. Thomas's radio messages became more frequent and more urgent as the weather worsened. He provided detailed forecasts, warned about dangerous storm systems moving through the area, and offered specific advice about protecting water sources from freezing. Most importantly, he began to suggest that Rebecca's current shelter might not be adequate for the severe weather that was approaching. "There's a storm coming in tomorrow that's going to drop the temperature to -20, Thomas's voice crackled through the radio one December evening. "I know you've made it through tough winters before, but this one's different. I've got a guest cabin on the ranch that's empty and heated. No strings attached, no questions asked. You could ride out the storm there and go back to your cave when the weather clears. Rebecca listened to the message while huddled in her cave, wrapped in every piece of clothing and bedding she possessed. The temperature had already dropped below zero, and she could feel the cold seeping through the rock walls, despite her efforts to insulate the space. Her water supplies were beginning to freeze, and she had been forced to keep a small fire burning constantly just to maintain a survivable temperature inside the cave. The offer of warm shelter was almost overwhelmingly tempting, but accepting. It would mean exposing herself to the kind of human contact she had spent 3 years avoiding. It would mean trusting someone with her physical safety in a way that felt impossible after everything she had experienced with Marcus. Most terrifying of all, it would mean acknowledging that her self-sufficient isolation might not be sustainable, that she might actually need help from another person. The storm that Thomas had predicted arrived with a violence that exceeded even his warnings. Snow fell for 36 hours straight, accompanied by winds that howled through the rocks with enough force to shake the walls of Rebecca's cave. The temperature dropped so low that her breath formed ice crystals in the air, and the small fire she maintained became insufficient to keep her core body temperature stable. By the second day of the storm, Rebecca realized she was in serious trouble. Her food supplies were nearly exhausted, her water had frozen solid despite her efforts to keep it liquid, and the cold was beginning to affect her ability to think clearly. She had reached the point where staying in the cave was likely to result in death from exposure, but leaving the cave in the middle of a blizzard was equally dangerous. The radio message that came that evening carried a tone of genuine alarm. "Rebecca, I don't know if you can hear this, but I'm worried about you. This storm is worse than anything we've had in 15 years, and I know your shelter can't be adequate for these conditions. I'm going to leave emergency supplies at the halfway point between your cave and the ranch house. There's a winter sleeping bag rated for Arctic conditions, chemical heat packs, and enough food for several days. I'll mark the location with reflective tape so you can find it even in the snow." The fact that Thomas was willing to venture out into dangerous storm conditions to leave supplies for her was both deeply moving and deeply frightening. It suggested a level of care and concern that Rebecca hadn't experienced since her grandmother's death, but it also created a sense of obligation that felt overwhelming. If Thomas was risking his own safety to help her, how could she continue to maintain the emotional distance that had protected her for so long? The decision to retrieve the emergency supplies required Rebecca to leave her cave during the worst storm she had ever experienced. The journey that normally took 20 minutes stretched into hours as she fought through snowdrifts and navigating by feel in near-zero visibility. When she finally found the supply cache Thomas had left, she was so exhausted and cold that she could barely manipulate the zippers and fasteners of the equipment he had provided. The Arctic sleeping bag and chemical heat packs probably saved her life that night, but they also forced Rebecca to confront the reality that her isolation was no longer sustainable. She had reached the limits of what one person could survive alone, and continuing to refuse help might mean choosing death over the possibility of human connection. The radio message she heard the next morning changed everything. Thomas's voice was hoarse with exhaustion, and she could hear genuine emotion breaking through his usually calm demeanor. "Rebecca, I hope you found the supplies and that you're okay. I've been up all night worrying about you, and I realize that I can't keep pretending this arrangement is working. You're going to die up there if you don't accept help, and I can't stand by and let that happen. I'm not going to force you to do anything, but I need you to know that you have options. The guest cabin is still available, no questions asked. Or if you prefer, I can help you find other arrangements that would give you the privacy you need while keeping you safe." For the first time since Thomas had discovered her location, Rebecca picked up the radio and pressed the transmit button. Her voice was barely a whisper, and she had to try several times before she could force the words out. I don't know how to trust people anymore." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. When Thomas finally responded, his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it. "You don't have to trust me all at once. You just have to trust me enough to stay alive while you figure out what comes next." Rebecca sat in her cave, holding the radio and feeling something crack open inside her chest. The conversation that followed was halting and difficult, full of long pauses and careful words, but it was the first real human communication she had experienced in over 3 years. Thomas didn't ask about her past, didn't demand explanations, and didn't try to convince her that she should want different things than she actually wanted. He simply offered practical help and waited for her to decide whether she was ready to accept it. The internal struggle that consumed the next several days was unlike anything Rebecca had experienced since fleeing Denver. Every instinct she had developed screamed that trusting another person was dangerous, that accepting help would lead inevitably to the kind of control and manipulation that had nearly destroyed her once before. But she also couldn't ignore the evidence that Thomas's behavior had been consistently respectful and non-threatening, or the reality that she needed help to survive. The breakthrough came when Rebecca realized that her current situation was actually a form of imprisonment that was just as limiting as the relationship she had fled. Fear of being hurt again had trapped her in a life that offered survival but no possibility of growth, connection, or genuine happiness. She had traded one form of captivity for another, and the walls of her cave had become as confining as the emotional walls Marcus had built around her. The decision to trust Thomas, even tentatively, felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But Rebecca was beginning to understand that staying on the cliff meant a slow death from isolation and exposure, while stepping off at least offered the possibility of learning to fly. The guest cabin on the Brennan Ranch sat nestled among a grove of aspen trees, approximately 2 miles from the main ranch house and connected by a well-maintained dirt road that Thomas kept clear year-round. When Rebecca first laid eyes on it through the swirling snow of that December evening, it looked like something from a dream she had forgotten she was capable of having. The structure was modest but well-built, constructed from the same weathered logs as the main ranch buildings but designed with obvious attention to comfort and functionality. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides of the building, providing protection from the elements and space for outdoor activities during warmer weather. Large windows faced east toward the valley, promising morning sunlight and views of the surrounding mountains. Most importantly to Rebecca, the cabin was positioned in a way that offered privacy and multiple escape routes should the need arise. Thomas had kept his word about the no questions asked arrangement. When Rebecca finally emerged from her cave on that storm-ravaged evening, carrying her few possessions in a backpack that had seen better days, he had been waiting at the agreed-upon meeting point with a snowmobile and enough winter gear to keep her warm during the journey to the cabin. Their interaction had been brief and purely functional, Thomas showing her how to operate the heating system, explaining where to find emergency supplies, and providing her with a set of keys that felt heavier in her hand than their actual weight suggested. "The radio works from here too," he had said before leaving. "Same frequency. I'll check in tomorrow to make sure everything's working properly, but otherwise, this is your space for as long as you need it." The first night in the cabin was both a relief and a source of overwhelming anxiety for Rebecca. The physical comfort was undeniable: a real bed with clean sheets, electric lighting that could be controlled with the flip of a switch, a bathroom with running water, and a shower that produced unlimited hot water. After 3 years of living in a cave, these basic amenities felt almost decadently luxurious, but the emotional adjustment was far more complex. The cabin represented a level of dependence on another person that Rebecca hadn't experienced since leaving Denver. Every comfort, every convenience, every moment of safety was possible only because Thomas was allowing her to be there. The gratitude she felt was mixed with a deep unease about what obligations that gratitude might create. Sleep came fitfully that first night, interrupted by dreams that confused the present with the past. Rebecca found herself checking and rechecking the locks on the doors, testing the windows to ensure they could be opened quickly if escape became necessary, and mentally cataloging every item in the cabin that could serve as a weapon if the need arose. The habits of hypervigilance that had kept her alive in the wilderness were difficult to abandon even in the safety of four walls and central heating. The radio call came the next morning, just as Thomas had promised. His voice carried the same calm tone that had characterized all their previous communications, asking about the heating system, the water pressure, and whether she had been able to find everything she needed. Rebecca responded with brief, factual answers, still uncertain about how much communication was safe or appropriate. But as the days passed and Thomas continued to respect the boundaries she had established, Rebecca began to relax in ways she hadn't experienced in years. The cabin's isolation provided many of the benefits of her cave-dwelling distance from other people: control over her environment, the ability to move through her daily routines without external pressure or interference. But it also offered opportunities for activities that had been impossible during her years in the wilderness. The cabin contained a small but well-stocked library, and Rebecca rediscovered the pleasure of reading for enjoyment rather than just for survival information. Books had been one of her greatest sources of comfort during her childhood with Eleanor, and she had mourned their absence during her years in the cave. Now she found herself spending hours reading novels, poetry, and essays that reminded her of aspects of herself that had been dormant for years. More importantly, the cabin's kitchen allowed Rebecca to prepare real meals for the first time since leaving Denver. Thomas had stocked the refrigerator and pantry with high-quality ingredients, and cooking became a form of meditation that connected her to memories of learning traditional recipes from her grandmother. The simple act of preparing food with proper tools and equipment reminded Rebecca of skills and interests that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the pleasure of creating something beautiful and nourishing. The physical transformation that began during her first weeks in the cabin was remarkable. Regular hot showers, adequate nutrition, and protection from the elements allowed Rebecca's body to begin recovering from the stress of wilderness survival. Her hair regained its natural texture and color, her skin healed from years of sun and wind exposure, and the chronic tension that had kept her muscles constantly prepared for fight or flight began to ease, but the emotional changes were more gradual and more complicated. Rebecca found herself experiencing feelings that she had suppressed for years, not just the negative emotions like fear and anger that had driven her to isolation, but positive emotions like curiosity, creativity, and something that might eventually develop into contentment. The process was often overwhelming, and there were days when she considered returning to her cave, simply because the emotional numbness of survival mode felt safer than the vulnerability of actually feeling things again. Thomas's approach to their developing relationship demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence that Rebecca found both comforting and suspicious. He never pushed for more interaction than she was comfortable with, never asked personal questions about her past, and never suggested that her current living situation was temporary or inadequate. But he also made himself consistently available, responding to radio calls promptly and providing practical help whenever she needed it. The breakthrough in their relationship came during a conversation about the ranch's cattle operation. Rebecca had been observing the animals from her cabin windows and had noticed patterns in their behavior that suggested some of the herd might be showing early signs of nutritional deficiency. When she mentioned this observation during one of their radio conversations, Thomas responded with genuine interest and respect for her insights. "You've got a good eye," he said. "I've been worried about the same thing, but I wasn't sure if I was seeing real problems or just being paranoid. Would you be willing to take a closer look at the herd and tell me what you think?" The request represented a fundamental shift in their dynamic. Instead of Thomas providing help to Rebecca, he was asking for her expertise and assistance. For the first time since leaving Denver, someone was treating Rebecca as a capable adult whose knowledge and skills had value. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. Rebecca's background in marketing had required her to understand consumer behavior and market trends, skills that translated surprisingly well to observing and analyzing animal behavior patterns. Her years in the wilderness had sharpened her ability to notice subtle changes in the environment and to identify cause and effect relationships that might not be obvious to casual observation. When she began studying Thomas's cattle herd, she discovered that she had developed expertise that was genuinely valuable. The nutritional deficiency she had identified was real and potentially serious. Several of the younger animals were showing signs of mineral depletion that could affect their growth and reproductive capacity if not addressed quickly. Rebecca was able to pinpoint the specific pastures where the problem was most severe and to suggest management strategies that would address the issue without disrupting the ranch's overall operations. Thomas implemented her recommendations immediately and kept her informed about the results. Within weeks, the affected animals began showing improvement, and Thomas made it clear that Rebecca's intervention had prevented what could have become a significant economic loss for the ranch. More importantly, he began asking for her input on other aspects of the operation, treating her as a valued consultant rather than a charity case. This shift in their relationship created space for Rebecca to begin thinking about herself as someone who had abilities and knowledge that could benefit others. The years in the cave had been about survival and self-protection, but her work with the cattle reminded her that she was capable of contributing to something larger than her own immediate needs. The feeling of being useful, of having her intelligence and observations respected, began to rebuild aspects of her self-esteem that had been damaged by her relationship with Marcus. The winter months passed more quickly than any period Rebecca could remember since her grandmother's death. The combination of physical comfort, intellectual stimulation, and gradually increasing human contact created a foundation for healing that she hadn't believed was possible. She began to sleep through the night without startling awake at every sound. She rediscovered her sense of humor, finding herself laughing at things she read or observed. Most remarkably, she began to look forward to her radio conversations with Thomas, rather than dreading them as potential sources of pressure or manipulation. But the most significant change was in Rebecca's relationship with her own future. For 3 years, she had lived entirely in the present moment, focused on immediate survival needs and immediate threats. The concept of planning beyond the next day or week had seemed impossible when every ounce of energy was required just to stay alive. Now surrounded by the safety and stability that Thomas had provided, Rebecca began to imagine what her life might look like if she continued to heal and grow. The possibility of eventually leaving the cabin didn't fill her with the same terror it once had. Thomas had demonstrated that human relationships didn't have to be controlling or manipulative, that it was possible for people to care about each other without demanding ownership or compliance. While Rebecca wasn't ready to venture back into the larger world, she was beginning to believe that she might someday want to try. The guest cabin had become more than just a shelter from the storm. It had become a laboratory for rediscovering who Rebecca might be if she wasn't constantly afraid. The person who emerged from that laboratory would be different from both the woman who had lived in Denver and the woman who had survived in the cave. She would be someone who had learned that isolation and connection were both choices rather than destinations, and that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Spring was still months away, but Rebecca could feel something changing in herself that had nothing to do with the weather. She was remembering what it felt like to be fully human, not just a survivor, but someone capable of growth, contribution, and genuine connection with another person. The journey wasn't complete, and there would be setbacks and challenges ahead, But for the first time in years, Rebecca was beginning to believe that the future might hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Thomas had given her more than shelter from the storm. He had given her space to remember who she was and time to discover who she might become. The gift was so profound that Rebecca sometimes felt overwhelmed by gratitude, but she was learning that overwhelming feelings didn't have to be dangerous. They could simply be part of being alive in the fullest sense of the word. The woman who would eventually walk out of that cabin would be someone neither Rebecca nor Thomas could fully predict, but she would be someone who had learned that trust was possible, that kindness existed, and that the human capacity for healing was far greater than either of them had dared to believe. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the valley's lower elevations. Rebecca was working in the cabin's small office space, analyzing grazing rotation data that Thomas had asked her to review, when her old cell phone, the one she had kept powered off for nearly 4 years, suddenly buzzed to life on the desk. Beside her, the sound was so unexpected that Rebecca knocked over her coffee cup, watching the dark liquid spread across the papers she had been studying. Her hands shook as she stared at the device, which she had only turned on that morning to transfer some old photos to Thomas's computer system for a ranch management project they were developing together. The phone had been off the grid for so long that she hadn't expected it to connect to any networks, let alone receive calls. The caller ID displayed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was unmistakably Denver. Rebecca's heart began to race as she considered the possibilities. Only a few people had ever known this number, and most of them had no reason to contact her after nearly 4 years of complete silence. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Same number. Same Denver area code. Against every instinct screaming at her to ignore the call, Rebecca pressed the answer button. Rebecca? Rebecca, thank God. This is Detective Sarah Walsh with Denver Police. I've been trying to reach you for months. The voice was professional, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that made Rebecca's stomach clench with anxiety. She hadn't spoken to law enforcement since leaving Denver, and the fact that police were looking for her suggested complications she wasn't prepared to handle. How did you get this number? Rebecca managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. We've been working a case that involves Marcus Hartwell, and your name came up in our investigation. Rebecca, I need you to know that you're not in any trouble, but we need to talk to you about your relationship with Mr. Hartwell. Can you tell me where you are? We can arrange protection if necessary. The mention of Marcus's name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. For months, she had been rebuilding her life and her sense of safety, learning to trust again and beginning to imagine a future that didn't revolve around fear and isolation. Now, with a single phone call, all of that progress felt like it was crumbling beneath her feet. Protection from what? Rebecca asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Detective Walsh's sigh was audible through the phone. Rebecca, Marcus Hartwell has been charged with multiple counts of domestic violence, stalking, and harassment involving 3 different women. The pattern of behavior described by these women matches what we found in the missing person report that was filed when you disappeared. We believe you may have been his first victim, and we need your testimony to establish a pattern of escalating behavior. The words seemed to echo in Rebecca's mind as she struggled to process their meaning. Other women. 3 other women. The realization that Marcus had continued to hurt people after she left, that her escape hadn't ended his pattern of abuse, filled her with a complex mixture of guilt, anger, and vindication. He told people I was missing? Rebecca asked. He filed a missing person report 6 months after you left Denver, claiming he was worried about your mental health and safety. He painted himself as a concerned boyfriend trying to find his girlfriend, who had suffered some kind of breakdown. Rebecca, we think he's been using that report to track your movements. Have you had any contact with him since leaving Denver? No, none. I've been completely off the grid. Rebecca's mind was racing, trying to understand the implications of what she was learning. You said 3 other women? 3 that we know of. The most recent victim, Jessica Chun, ended up in the hospital with a concussion and 2 broken ribs. She finally pressed charges last month, and when we started investigating, we found a pattern going back several years. Rebecca, your disappearance makes a lot more sense now. We think you may have been the first person to successfully escape from him. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Detective Walsh explaining the legal case against Marcus, and the crucial role that Rebecca's testimony could play in establishing his pattern of behavior. The detective was careful to emphasize that Rebecca's participation was voluntary, but she also made it clear that without testimony from earlier victims, the prosecution's case might not be strong enough to prevent Marcus from eventually being released to hurt more women. When the call finally ended, Rebecca sat in the cabin's office staring at the now silent phone, feeling as though the stable world she had been building was collapsing around her. The thought of returning to Denver, of facing Marcus in a courtroom, of having her private trauma examined and questioned by lawyers and judges felt impossible. But the knowledge that other women were being hurt by the same man who had driven her to live in a cave was equally unbearable. Thomas found her there an hour later, when he arrived for their scheduled meeting about spring pasture management. One look at Rebecca's face told him that something significant had happened, and his immediate concern was so genuine that Rebecca found herself explaining the entire situation before she had consciously decided to share it with him. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as Rebecca described the phone call and its implications. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the complexities of what she had told him. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked. The question was so simple and so different from what Rebecca had expected that she almost started crying. Thomas wasn't telling her what she should do, wasn't minimizing her fears or pressuring her to be brave. He was simply asking what she wanted and waiting for her answer. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "Part of me wants to help those women, to make sure Marcus can't hurt anyone else. But the thought of going back to Denver, of seeing him again, of having to relive everything that happened, I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You survived 3 years in a cave," Thomas said quietly. "You rebuilt your life from nothing. You've been helping me manage this ranch for months, making decisions that affect the livelihood of everyone who works here. Rebecca, you're a lot stronger than you think you are." The next several days were among the most difficult Rebecca had experienced since arriving at the ranch. The peace and stability she had found in the cabin felt fragile and temporary, overshadowed by the knowledge that her past was demanding her attention, whether she was ready or not. She found herself slipping back into some of the hypervigilant behaviors that had characterized her early days out of the cave, checking locks obsessively, startling at unexpected sounds, losing sleep to anxiety about threats that might or might not be real. But she also found that the coping mechanisms she had developed during her months of healing were stronger than she had realized. The skills she had learned for managing overwhelming emotions, the confidence she had rebuilt through her work with the ranch, and most importantly, the trust she had developed in Thomas's consistent support, all helped her navigate this crisis in ways that would have been impossible when she first left the cave. The decision to return to Denver came gradually, through a series of conversations with Detective Walsh, with victim advocates who specialized in domestic violence cases, and with Thomas, who offered to accompany her if she decided to testify. The turning point came when Rebecca spoke with Jessica Chun, the most recent victim, who had specifically asked to talk with her. Jessica was 26 years old, a graphic designer who had been dating Marcus for 8 months, before the violence escalated to the point where she finally sought help. Her story was eerily similar to Rebecca's: the gradual isolation from friends and family, the systematic undermining of her confidence and judgment, the escalating pattern of emotional and eventually physical abuse. But Jessica had something that Rebecca hadn't had. A support system that recognized the warning signs and encouraged her to leave before the damage became irreversible. "The prosecutor told me about you," Jessica said during their phone conversation. "About how you disappeared and they couldn't find you to testify. I want you to know that I don't blame you for that. I understand why you ran. But I also want you to know that if you're willing to testify now, it could make all the difference for the other women he's hurt." The conversation with Jessica forced Rebecca to confront a truth she had been avoiding. Her escape from Marcus had been an act of self-preservation, but it had also been an act of abandonment of the other women who would inevitably cross his path. She couldn't have known at the time that he would continue to hurt people, but now that she did know, she had a choice about whether to use her experience to help stop him. The decision to testify wasn't just about legal justice, it was about reclaiming her voice and her agency in a situation where both had been systematically stripped away. For years, Marcus had controlled the narrative about their relationship, had defined her as unstable and unreliable, had used her disappearance as evidence of her mental instability. Testifying would give Rebecca the opportunity to tell her own story in her own words, and to reclaim control over how her experience was understood and interpreted. Thomas's response to her decision was characteristically supportive and practical. He arranged for the ranch to be managed in their absence, coordinated with the legal team to ensure that Rebecca would have appropriate support during the trial process, and made it clear that her job and her place at the ranch would be waiting for her regardless of how long the legal proceedings took. "This isn't about being brave," he told her the night before they were scheduled to leave for Denver. "This is about being yourself, the person who notices when cattle are sick, who survived 3 years alone in the mountains, who learned to trust again even after being hurt. You don't have to be anyone other than who you are." The journey back to Denver felt surreal to Rebecca, like traveling backward through time to a version of herself that she could barely remember. The city looked the same, but she felt like a completely different person returning to a place that belonged to someone else's life. The woman who had fled in the middle of a snowy night nearly 4 years earlier had been broken and desperate. The woman who returned was scarred but strong, damaged but not defeated. The trial itself would test every aspect of the healing and growth Rebecca had achieved during her time at the ranch. She would have to face Marcus across a courtroom, would have to relive the most painful period of her life under cross-examination, and would have to trust in a legal system that hadn't protected her the first time she needed help. But she would also have the opportunity to speak truth to power, to use her voice in service of other women who deserved protection, and to demonstrate to herself and to Marcus that he had not succeeded in destroying her. The woman who had learned to survive in a cave, who had rebuilt her life on a remote mountain ranch, who had learned to trust again after betrayal, was ready to face the test that would determine whether her transformation was complete or merely temporary. The real trial wasn't happening in the courthouse, it was happening in Rebecca's heart and mind, where she would discover whether the strength she had built was strong enough to carry her through the most difficult challenge she had ever voluntarily accepted. The courthouse in downtown Denver stood like a monument to justice, its imposing granite facade reflecting the morning sun as Rebecca walked up the steps beside Thomas and her attorney, Maria Rodriguez. 6 months had passed since that first phone call from Detective Walsh, and the legal proceedings had unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized the American justice system at its best. Rebecca's testimony had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Marcus Hartwell. Over 3 days of direct examination and cross-examination, she had recounted the systematic pattern of psychological manipulation and control that had driven her to flee Denver in the middle of a winter night. Her voice had remained steady as she described the gradual isolation from friends and family, the constant criticism disguised as helpful guidance, and the emotional terrorism that had convinced her that disappearing was safer than staying. Cross-examination had been brutal, with Marcus's defense attorney attempting to portray Rebecca as an unstable woman who had fabricated abuse allegations to justify her own irresponsible behavior. But the months of healing at the ranch had given Rebecca something she hadn't possessed 4 years earlier: unshakable confidence in her own perceptions and experiences. When the defense attorney suggested that her extended isolation in the mountains proved her mental instability, Rebecca had looked directly at the jury and explained that choosing solitude over abuse was not evidence of insanity, it was evidence of survival instinct. The other victims had testified as well, each woman's story adding another layer to the portrait of Marcus as a calculated predator who targeted intelligent, accomplished women and systematically destroyed their self-confidence and autonomy. Jessica Chun's testimony about the physical violence that had finally prompted her to seek help provided the dramatic climax that the prosecution needed to demonstrate the escalating nature of Marcus's behavior. But it was Rebecca's testimony that had provided the foundation for understanding Marcus's methods and motivations. Her ability to articulate the subtle psychological tactics he employed, combined with her obvious recovery and strength, had given the jury a clear picture of both the damage he inflicted and the resilience of his victims. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Marcus Hartwell was found guilty on all counts: 3 counts of domestic violence, multiple counts of stalking and harassment, and 1 count of filing false police reports. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, with mandatory participation in domestic violence intervention programs and a lifetime restraining order preventing him from contacting any of his victims. As the bailiff led Marcus away in handcuffs, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years: closure. The man who had convinced her that she was weak, unreliable, and incapable of sound judgment had been publicly exposed as a criminal whose own judgment was so flawed that society required his removal from the community. The woman he had tried to convince was mentally unstable, had provided testimony so clear and compelling that 12 strangers had unanimously agreed to send him to prison. But the real triumph wasn't in Marcus's conviction, it was in what Rebecca had discovered about herself during the process of seeking justice. The woman who testified in that courtroom was not the same person who had fled Denver 4 years earlier, nor was she the same person who had emerged from the cave 6 months earlier. She was someone entirely new, forged by survival, tempered by isolation, and strengthened by the patient kindness of a rancher who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. The journey back to the ranch took place in comfortable silence, with Thomas driving and Rebecca watching the familiar mountains grow larger as they left the city behind. The Colorado landscape that had once represented exile and desperation now felt like home in a way that surprised her with its intensity. The peaks and valleys that had hidden her during her years of healing were welcoming her back, not as a refugee, but as someone who belonged. The ranch had continued to thrive during their absence, managed by Janet Morrison and the crew with the competence that comes from years of working together toward common goals. But Rebecca's return brought new energy and purpose to the operation. Her insights into cattle behavior and pasture management had proven so valuable that Thomas had formally offered her a partnership in the ranch, not as charity or therapy, but as recognition of her genuine contributions to the business. The partnership agreement they signed that autumn represented far more than a business arrangement. It was Rebecca's formal re-entry into the world of human community and mutual responsibility. For the first time since her grandmother's death, she was part of something larger than her own survival, invested in outcomes that would affect other people's livelihoods and well-being. The guest cabin became Rebecca's permanent home, renovated and expanded to include office space for the ranch's business operations and a workshop where she could pursue the woodworking and fiber arts that had become her passion during the long winter evenings. The isolation that had once been necessary for her psychological survival became a chosen lifestyle that provided the solitude she needed for creative work while maintaining connection to the larger community of the ranch. Rebecca's relationship with Thomas evolved gradually from mutual respect to deep friendship to something that neither of them felt the need to define or label. They worked together daily, shared meals several times a week, and had developed the kind of easy companionship that comes from shared challenges and complementary skills. Thomas never pressured Rebecca for more emotional intimacy than she was comfortable offering, and Rebecca never felt obligated to provide more than she was genuinely ready to give. The romance, when it finally developed, emerged so naturally from their existing relationship that neither of them could pinpoint exactly when friendship became love. It was a progression marked more by deepening trust and shared dreams than by dramatic declarations or passionate intensity. They were two people who had learned that the most profound connections often develop slowly, built on daily demonstrations of character rather than overwhelming emotion. Their wedding took place the following spring in the meadow where Rebecca had first encountered evidence of Thomas's care for the land. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by the ranch crew, a few local friends, and Jessica Chen, who had become Rebecca's closest confidant during the legal proceedings and recovery process. Eleanor's locket, which Rebecca had worn throughout her years in the wilderness, was carefully incorporated into her wedding dress, a tangible connection to the grandmother who had taught her that love should strengthen rather than diminish the people it touches. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Rebecca's new life was her work with other women who had experienced domestic violence. Her story had gained national attention during Marcus's trial, and she began receiving letters from women across the country who recognized their own experiences in her testimony. Working with local domestic violence organizations, Rebecca developed workshops and support programs that helped survivors understand that healing was possible even after the most devastating betrayals of trust. The Wilderness Recovery Program that Rebecca and Thomas established on the ranch became a model for trauma-informed therapy that combined traditional counseling with outdoor education and practical skill building. Women who had been convinced of their own helplessness learned to build shelters, start fires, navigate by the stars, and trust their own instincts in environments where those instincts were reliable guides to safety. The program's success wasn't measured only in the number of women who completed it, but in the transformations that took place during the weeks they spent learning to survive and thrive in the natural world. City women who had never been alone in the wilderness discovered physical and emotional strength they hadn't known they possessed. Women who had been isolated by abusive partners learned to work together toward common goals. Most importantly, women who had been convinced that they couldn't trust their own judgment learned to make life and death decisions in environments where their choices had immediate and obvious consequences. Rebecca's role in the program drew on all aspects of her experience. Her years in the business world provided organizational and communication skills. Her time in the cave had given her practical wilderness expertise, and her journey through healing had taught her how to guide others through similar transformations. But perhaps most valuable was her ability to demonstrate, simply by existing, that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, and that the strongest people were often those who had been broken and had chosen to rebuild themselves. Ranch prospered under Rebecca and Thomas's joint management, becoming known throughout Colorado for both its sustainable cattle operations and its innovative approach to trauma recovery. Agricultural colleges sent students to study their grazing management techniques, while psychology programs incorporated their wilderness therapy methods into curriculum for treating post-traumatic stress. But for Rebecca, the most profound measure of her transformation was much simpler. She could sleep through the night without startling awake at every sound. She could disagree with Thomas without fearing that he would withdraw his love or support. She could make decisions based on her own judgment without second-guessing every choice. Most remarkably, She could imagine a future that extended beyond immediate survival plans for expanding the ranch. Dreams of traveling to places she had only read about. Hopes for children who would grow up understanding that strength and gentleness were not contradictory qualities. The woman who had once lived like a wild animal in a mountain cave had become someone who chose her own definition of civilization. She had learned that true safety came not from hiding from the world, but from developing the skills and relationships necessary to navigate it successfully. She had discovered that the opposite of abuse was not isolation, but rather the kind of love that encouraged growth, respected autonomy, and celebrated individual strength. On quiet evenings, when Rebecca walked the familiar trails around the ranch, she sometimes thought about the path that had brought her from that Denver apartment to this mountain sanctuary. The journey had been longer and more difficult than anything she could have imagined, but it had also been more transformative than she had believed possible. The cave that had sheltered her during her darkest years was still there, hidden behind its curtain of blackberry vines, slowly returning to its natural state. Rebecca visited it occasionally, not from nostalgia, but from gratitude for the refuge it had provided when she had needed it most. The woman who had once hidden there in fear now stood in its entrance with confidence, understanding that she carried her safety within herself rather than depending on external circumstances to provide it. Rebecca Thornfield had learned the most important lesson that any human being can master: that survival is not enough, that healing is possible, and that the capacity for transformation exists within every person who has the courage to believe that tomorrow can be different from yesterday. Her story had become proof that even the most damaged people can rebuild their lives, that trust can be restored after betrayal, and that love, the right kind of love, has the power to heal wounds that seem impossible to mend. The ranch would continue to be her home, Thomas would continue to be her partner, and the work of helping other women find their own paths to healing would continue to give meaning to her days. But the most important transformation was complete. Rebecca had rediscovered her own humanity, not despite the years she had spent living like a frightened animal, but because of the strength and resilience those years had taught her. She was no longer running from anything. She was running toward everything. 5 years after Rebecca and Thomas's wedding, the Brennan Ranch had become something neither of them could have envisioned during those early days when their relationship consisted of radio conversations and carefully left supplies. What had begun as a cattle operation with a guest cabin had evolved into an internationally recognized center for trauma recovery, sustainable agriculture, and community healing that drew visitors from around the world. The Wilderness Recovery program had expanded far beyond its original scope of helping domestic violence survivors. The ranch now hosted programs for combat veterans dealing with PTSD, survivors of human trafficking, former inmates transitioning back into society, and young adults aging out of the foster care system. Each program was carefully tailored to address the specific trauma patterns and healing needs of its participants, but all shared the core philosophy that Rebecca and Thomas had developed: that humans heal most effectively when they reconnect with their own capability, their relationship with the natural world, and their ability to contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves. Rebecca stood on the porch of what was now called the main lodge, watching the sun rise over a valley that had been transformed by careful stewardship and intentional community building. The original ranch house had been expanded into a complex of buildings that included dormitories for program participants, classrooms and therapy spaces, workshops for practical skills training, and a commercial kitchen that could feed the 60 people who now lived and worked on the property during peak program seasons. The physical changes to the landscape were dramatic but harmonious with the natural environment. Thomas and Rebecca had worked with environmental engineers and permaculture specialists to create systems that enhanced rather than disrupted the existing ecosystem. Solar panels and wind generators provided renewable energy, while carefully designed water management systems captured and filtered run off in ways that supported both human needs and wildlife habitat. But the most remarkable transformation was in the people who came to the ranch as participants and often stayed as staff members, volunteer coordinators, or community partners. The ranch had become a living demonstration that healing was not just possible but sustainable, that trauma survivors could become powerful agents of change in other people's recovery journeys. Maria Gutierrez had arrived at the ranch 18 months earlier as a participant in the domestic violence recovery program, fleeing an abusive marriage that had lasted 12 years and left her convinced that she was incapable of making good decisions about her own life. She was now the program's lead wilderness instructor, teaching survival skills to new participants with the kind of quiet confidence that came from having tested her own capabilities against genuine challenges and discovered her own strength. David Park had completed the veteran recovery program 2 years earlier, after struggling for months with severe PTSD following 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He now managed the ranch's sustainable agriculture operations, overseeing the production of organic vegetables and grass-fed beef that supplied not only the ranch community, but also restaurants and farmers markets throughout the region. His military leadership skills had found new purpose in coordinating complex agricultural systems that required precision, planning, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Carmen Rodriguez had aged out of the foster care system with no family support and limited life skills, arriving at the ranch through a partnership program with the state's Social Services Department. She was now pursuing a degree in environmental science through online courses while working as the ranch's youth program coordinator, helping other former foster children develop the practical and emotional skills necessary for independent living. Each success story represented not just individual healing, but the creation of a more comprehensive support network for future participants. The ranch had developed what Rebecca and Thomas called a community of care, an interconnected web of relationships where people who had experienced trauma could find multiple pathways to healing and multiple models of what recovery could look like. The academic and professional recognition that the ranch had received was gratifying but secondary to the human impact of their work. Rebecca had been invited to speak at conferences on trauma recovery, sustainable development, and innovative therapeutic approaches. She had co-authored papers with university researchers studying the effectiveness of wilderness therapy in treating complex PTSD. The ranch had been featured in documentaries about alternative approaches to mental health treatment and had received grants from foundations interested in supporting community-based healing initiatives. But for Rebecca, the most meaningful recognition came from the letters and emails she received from former participants who had gone on to rebuild their lives in ways that honored both their survival and their aspirations. Jessica Chun, who had testified alongside Rebecca at Marcus's trial, had become a graphic designer specializing in materials for domestic violence organizations. She credited her time at the ranch with teaching her that her creativity could be a tool for social change rather than just personal expression. Michael Santos, a combat veteran who had completed the ranch's program, had returned to his hometown in Texas and established a similar wilderness therapy initiative for military families. His program had already helped dozens of veterans and their spouses develop healthier coping mechanisms and stronger family relationships. The ripple effects extended far beyond the individuals who had directly participated in ranch programs. Family members, friends, and communities that received back healed and empowered people experienced their own transformation. Children who had watched their mothers struggle with the aftermath of abuse saw those same women develop confidence, leadership skills, and the ability to create safe and nurturing homes. Communities that had written off certain individuals as permanently damaged discovered that, with appropriate support, those same people could become valuable contributors to local economies and social networks. Rebecca's own family had grown in ways that reflected the ranch's philosophy of chosen community and intentional relationship building. She and Thomas had welcomed their first child, Eleanor Rose Brennan, 3 years earlier. Named for Rebecca's grandmother, Eleanor was growing up surrounded by the kind of extended family that most modern children never experience. Dozens of adults who were invested in her well-being and development, who understood that raising healthy children required community support, and who modeled the kind of resilience and compassion that Rebecca wanted her daughter to embody. The ranch's children's program had evolved organically as staff members and long-term participants started families. Eleanor was part of a small cohort of children who were growing up with an unusual combination of privilege and awareness, surrounded by natural beauty and economic security, but also exposed from an early age to the realities of human suffering and the possibilities of healing. These children were learning practical skills that most of their peers would never develop: how to grow food, care for animals, read weather patterns, and navigate safely through wilderness environments. But they were also learning emotional skills that were equally rare: how to recognize signs of trauma in others, how to offer support without taking responsibility for other people's healing, and how to understand their own emotions and needs without being overwhelmed by them. The ranch's educational philosophy emphasized that strength and vulnerability were not contradictory qualities, that helping others required first learning to care for oneself, and that true security came from developing capabilities rather than avoiding challenges. Eleanor and the other ranch children were growing up with a sophisticated understanding of human resilience that would serve them well regardless of what challenges they might face in their own lives. Thomas had found his own unexpected calling in the work that had grown around Rebecca's healing journey. His background in sustainable agriculture and land management had provided the practical foundation for the ranch's programs, but he had discovered gifts for teaching and mentoring that he hadn't known he possessed. He had become particularly skilled at working with men who were struggling with the aftermath of trauma, helping them understand that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. The men's recovery program that Thomas had developed focused heavily on redefining masculinity in ways that honored both toughness and tenderness. Participants learned that protecting others sometimes meant learning to process their own emotions effectively, that providing for their families required first learning to care for their own mental and physical health, and that real strength came from the ability to be vulnerable in appropriate relationships. The partnership between Rebecca and Thomas had become a model for the kind of relationship that many program participants were learning to create in their own lives, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that healthy love empowered rather than controlled. Their relationship demonstrated that it was possible for two people who had experienced significant trauma to create something together that was stronger and more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. The financial sustainability of the ranch had been achieved through a combination of program fees, grants, donations, and the agricultural enterprises that provided both therapeutic activities and revenue streams. But more importantly, the ranch had achieved what economists call social sustainability, the creation of systems and relationships that could continue to produce positive outcomes even as individual people moved through the community. The waiting list for ranch programs now extended months into the future, but Rebecca and Thomas had resisted the temptation to expand faster than they could maintain quality. They had learned that healing required time, attention, and the kind of individualized care that became impossible when programs grew beyond a certain scale. Instead, they had focused on training other organizations to replicate their methods, sharing their curriculum and best practices with groups around the country that were establishing similar programs. The ranch's influence had spread through this network of affiliated programs, creating a movement toward trauma-informed care that emphasized empowerment over treatment, capability building over symptom management, and community healing over individual therapy. Rebecca and Thomas had become inadvertent leaders in a growing understanding that Trauma was not just a personal problem requiring professional intervention, but a community challenge that required community solutions. As Rebecca stood on the lodge porch watching the sun illuminate the valley that had become home to so many healing journeys, she reflected on the path that had brought her from that cave to this moment. The woman who had once hidden from human contact out of fear had become someone who created spaces where human contact could be healing rather than harmful. The transformation wasn't complete. Rebecca knew that healing was an ongoing process, rather than a destination, that maintaining mental health required the same kind of daily attention that maintaining physical health demanded. But she also knew that she had developed the skills, relationships, and understanding necessary to navigate whatever challenges might come. The ranch would continue to evolve, would face new challenges and discover new possibilities, would welcome new people seeking healing and say goodbye to others who were ready to take their recovery into the wider world. But the foundation that Rebecca and Thomas had built, the understanding that trauma could be transformed into wisdom, that isolation could give way to chosen community, and that the most broken people often became the most powerful healers, would endure. Eleanor Rose Brennan would grow up in a world where she understood from the beginning that humans were capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary resilience. That safety came from capability rather than avoidance, and that the purpose of healing was not to forget the past, but to transform it into fuel for creating a better future. The cave where Rebecca had once hidden was now a destination for program participants who were ready to confront their own capacity for survival and self-reliance. It had been preserved as a monument to the understanding that sometimes the journey toward healing required first learning to be alone with oneself, to distinguish between solitude that nourished and isolation that diminished. But more than anything, the ranch stood as proof that the human capacity for transformation was far greater than the human capacity for destruction, that love could overcome fear, and that the courage to heal oneself inevitably became the power to heal others. 5 years after Rebecca and Thomas's wedding, the Brennan Ranch had become something neither of them could have envisioned during those early days when their relationship consisted of radio conversations and carefully left supplies. What had begun as a cattle operation with a guest cabin had evolved into an internationally recognized center for trauma recovery, sustainable agriculture, and community healing that drew visitors from around the world. The Wilderness Recovery program had expanded far beyond its original scope of helping domestic violence survivors. The ranch now hosted programs for combat veterans dealing with PTSD, survivors of human trafficking, former inmates transitioning back into society, and young adults aging out of the foster care system. Each program was carefully tailored to address the specific trauma patterns and healing needs of its participants, but all shared the core philosophy that Rebecca and Thomas had developed, that humans heal most effectively when they reconnect with their own capability, their relationship with the natural world, and their ability to contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves. Rebecca stood on the porch of what was now called the main lodge, watching the sun rise over a valley that had been transformed by careful stewardship and intentional community building. The original ranch house had been expanded into a complex of buildings that included dormitories for program participants, classrooms and therapy spaces, workshops for practical skills training, and a commercial kitchen that could feed the 60 people who now lived and worked on the property during peak program seasons. The physical changes to the landscape were dramatic but harmonious with the natural environment. Thomas and Rebecca had worked with environmental engineers and permaculture specialists to create systems that enhanced rather than disrupted the existing ecosystem. Solar panels and wind generators provided renewable energy, while carefully designed water management systems captured and filtered runoff in ways that supported both human needs and wildlife habitat. But the most remarkable transformation was in the people who came to the ranch as participants and often stayed as staff members, volunteer coordinators, or community partners. The ranch had become a living demonstration that healing was not just possible, but sustainable. That trauma survivors could become powerful agents of change in other people's recovery journeys. Maria Gutierrez had arrived at the ranch 18 months earlier as a participant in the domestic violence recovery program, fleeing an abusive marriage that had lasted 12 years and left her convinced that she was incapable of making good decisions about her own life. She was now the program's lead wilderness instructor, teaching survival skills to new participants with the kind of quiet confidence that came from having tested her own capabilities against genuine challenges and discovered her own strength. David Park had completed the veteran recovery program 2 years earlier, after struggling for months with severe PTSD following 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He now managed the ranch's sustainable agriculture operations, overseeing the production of organic vegetables and grass-fed beef that supplied not only the ranch community, but also restaurants and farmers markets throughout the region. His military leadership skills had found new purpose in coordinating complex agricultural systems that required precision, planning, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Carmen Rodriguez had aged out of the foster care system with no family support and limited life skills, arriving at the ranch through a partnership program with the state's Social Services Department. She was now pursuing a degree in environmental science through online courses while working as the ranch's youth program coordinator, helping other former foster children develop the practical and emotional skills necessary for independent living. Each success story represented not just individual healing, but the creation of a more comprehensive support network for future participants. The ranch had developed what Rebecca and Thomas called a community of care, an interconnected web of relationships where people who had experienced trauma could find multiple pathways to healing and multiple models of what recovery could look like. The academic and professional recognition that the ranch had received was gratifying but secondary to the human impact of their work. Rebecca had been invited to speak at conferences on trauma recovery, sustainable development, and innovative therapeutic approaches. She had co-authored papers with university researchers studying the effectiveness of wilderness therapy in treating complex PTSD. The ranch had been featured in documentaries about alternative approaches to mental health treatment and had received grants from foundations interested in supporting community-based healing initiatives. But for Rebecca, the most meaningful recognition came from the letters and emails she received from former participants who had gone on to rebuild their lives in ways that honored both their survival and their aspirations. Jessica Chun, who had testified alongside Rebecca at Marcus's trial, had become a graphic designer specializing in materials for domestic violence organizations. She credited her time at the ranch with teaching her that her creativity could be a tool for social change rather than just personal expression. Michael Santos, a combat veteran who had completed the ranch's program, had returned to his hometown in Texas and established a similar wilderness therapy initiative for military families. His program had already helped dozens of veterans and their spouses develop healthier coping mechanisms and stronger family relationships. The ripple effects extended far beyond the individuals who had directly participated in ranch programs. Family members, friends, and communities that received back healed and empowered people experienced their own transformation. Children who had watched their mothers struggle with the aftermath of abuse saw those same women develop confidence, leadership skills, and the ability to create safe and nurturing homes. Communities that had written off certain individuals as permanently damaged discovered that with appropriate support, those same people could become valuable contributors to local economies and social networks. Rebecca's own family had grown in ways that reflected the ranch's philosophy of chosen community and intentional relationship building. She and Thomas had welcomed their first child, Eleanor Rose Brennan, 3 years earlier. Named for Rebecca's grandmother, Eleanor was growing up surrounded by the kind of extended family that most modern children never experience. Dozens of adults who were invested in her well-being and development, who understood that raising healthy children required community support, and who modeled the kind of resilience and compassion that Rebecca wanted her daughter to embody. The ranch's children's program had evolved organically as staff members and long-term participants started families. Eleanor was part of a small cohort of children who were growing up with an unusual combination of privilege and awareness, surrounded by natural beauty and economic security, but also exposed from an early age to the realities of human suffering and the possibilities of healing. These children were learning practical skills that most of their peers would never develop: how to grow food, care for animals, read weather patterns, and navigate safely through wilderness environments. But they were also learning emotional skills that were equally rare: how to recognize signs of trauma in others, how to offer support without taking responsibility for other people's healing, and how to understand their own emotions and needs without being overwhelmed by them. The ranch's educational philosophy emphasized that strength and vulnerability were not contradictory qualities, that helping others required first learning to care for oneself, and that true security came from developing capabilities rather than avoiding challenges. Eleanor and the other ranch children were growing up with a sophisticated understanding of human resilience that would serve them well regardless of what challenges they might face in their own lives. Thomas had found his own unexpected calling in the work that had grown around Rebecca's healing journey. His background in sustainable agriculture and land management had provided the practical foundation for the ranch's programs, but he had discovered gifts for teaching and mentoring that he hadn't known he possessed. He had become particularly skilled at working with men who were struggling with the aftermath of trauma, helping them understand that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. The men's recovery program that Thomas had developed focused heavily on redefining masculinity in ways that honored both toughness and tenderness. Participants learned that protecting others sometimes meant learning to process their own emotions effectively, that providing for their families required first learning to care for their own mental and physical health, and that real strength came from the ability to be vulnerable in appropriate relationships. The partnership between Rebecca and Thomas had become a model for the kind of relationship that many program participants were learning to create in their own. Love is built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that healthy love empowered rather than controlled. Their relationship demonstrated that it was possible for two people who had experienced significant trauma to create something together that was stronger and more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. The financial sustainability of the ranch had been achieved through a combination of program fees, grants, donations, and the agricultural enterprises that provided both therapeutic activities and revenue streams. But more importantly, the ranch had achieved what economists call social sustainability, the creation of systems and relationships that could continue to produce positive outcomes even as individual people move through the community. The waiting list for ranch programs now extended months into the future, but Rebecca and Thomas had resisted the temptation to expand faster than they could maintain quality. They had learned that healing required time, attention, and the kind of individualized care that became impossible when programs grew beyond a certain scale. Instead, they had focused on training other organizations to replicate their methods, sharing their curriculum and best practices with groups around the country that were establishing similar programs. The ranch's influence had spread through this network of affiliated programs, creating a movement toward trauma-informed care that emphasized empowerment over treatment, capability building over symptom management, and community healing over individual therapy. Rebecca and Thomas had become inadvertent leaders in a growing understanding that trauma was not just a personal problem requiring professional intervention, but a community challenge that required community solutions. As Rebecca stood on the lodge porch watching the sun illuminate the valley that had become home to so many healing journeys, she reflected on the path that had brought her from that cave to this moment. The woman who had once hidden from human contact out of fear had become someone who created spaces where human contact could be healing rather than harmful. The transformation wasn't complete. Rebecca knew that healing was an ongoing process, rather than a destination. That maintaining mental health required the same kind of daily attention that maintaining physical health demanded. But she also knew that she had developed the skills, relationships, and understanding necessary to navigate whatever challenges might come. The ranch would continue to evolve, would face new challenges and discover new possibilities, would welcome new people seeking healing and say goodbye to others who were ready to take their recovery into the wider world. But the foundation that Rebecca and Thomas had built, the understanding that trauma could be transformed into wisdom, that isolation could give way to chosen community, and that the most broken people often became the most powerful healers, would endure. Eleanor Rose Brennan would grow up in a world where she understood from the beginning that humans were capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary resilience, that safety came from capability rather than avoidance, and that the purpose of healing was not to forget the past but to transform it into fuel for creating a better future. The cave where Rebecca had once hidden was now a destination for program participants who were ready to confront their own capacity for survival and self-reliance. It had been preserved as a monument to the understanding that sometimes the journey toward healing required first learning to be alone with oneself, to distinguish between solitude that nourished and isolation that diminished. But more than anything, the ranch stood as proof that the human capacity for transformation was far greater than the human capacity for destruction, that love could overcome fear, and that the courage to heal oneself inevitably became the power to heal others. 10 years had passed since Rebecca Thornfield first emerged from her mountain cave to accept help from a stranger who would become her husband, partner, and co-creator of something neither of them could have imagined. On this crisp October morning, she stood at the edge of what had once been her solitary refuge. But now she wasn't alone. Eleanor Rose, now 7 years old, picked her way carefully along the rocky path, her small backpack filled with the supplies for their traditional annual camping trip to the cave where her mother had once lived in isolation. Behind them walked Marcus, not the Marcus who had terrorized Rebecca's past, but Marcus Brennan Chun, their 4-year-old son, named in a deliberate act of reclaiming a word that had once carried only pain. The decision to name their son Marcus had been Rebecca's alone, made after years of therapy and reflection about the difference between forgetting trauma and transforming it. She had realized that allowing her abuser to maintain ownership of even his name gave him power he didn't deserve. By choosing that name for a child who would grow up understanding consent, respect, and the difference between love and control, Rebecca had completed a circle of healing that even she hadn't known was possible. "Mama, tell us again about the time you lived here," Eleanor requested, settling onto a flat rock that had once served as Rebecca's dining table. The child had heard this story many times, but she understood instinctively that some stories became more meaningful with each telling. That repetition could deepen understanding rather than diminish interest. Rebecca looked at her children, Eleanor, with her grandmother's thoughtful eyes and her father's steady temperament, young Marcus with his boundless curiosity and innate empathy, and marveled at how the narrative of her life had transformed. The story she was about to tell was the same story she had lived, but the meaning had changed completely through the lens of everything that had followed. "I came here because I was very scared and very hurt," Rebecca began, using the age-appropriate language she had developed for explaining complex trauma to children. "Someone I trusted had made me believe that I couldn't trust my own thoughts or feelings, and I needed time to remember who I really was." The cave behind them had been preserved but modified over the years. It now served as an outdoor classroom for the ranch's survival skills programs, equipped with safety features and educational materials while maintaining its essential character as a place where humans could experience genuine self-reliance. Solar-powered lighting provided illumination when needed, and emergency communication equipment ensured that no one would ever again face a life-threatening situation without access to help. But more importantly, the cave had been transformed from a place of hiding into a place of teaching. Hundreds of people had now spent time in this space, learning the skills that Rebecca had taught herself through trial and error, understanding that the ability to be alone with oneself was different from the compulsion to avoid others. The important thing to understand, Rebecca continued, watching her children absorb this familiar but always evolving story, is that I wasn't wrong to come here. I needed this place to be safe while I figured out how to be safe in the world, with other people. But I also wasn't meant to stay here forever. Eleanor nodded silently. At 7, she already understood more about human resilience and recovery than most adults ever learned. She had grown up surrounded by people who had survived terrible things and had chosen to transform their survival into service to others. Her normal included therapeutic horseback riding sessions for trauma survivors, communal dinners where former program participants shared their success stories, and bedtime stories about people who had overcome challenges that would have defeated others. Young Marcus, at 4, was just beginning to understand that their family was different from most others, that their ranch was a place where people came to heal from hurts that couldn't be seen, and that his parents' love story had begun with someone needing help and someone else choosing to provide it. The annual camping trip to the cave had become a family tradition, but it was also a deliberate educational experience. Rebecca and Thomas wanted their children to understand viscerally what survival required, to develop confidence in their own capabilities, and to appreciate the difference between choosing solitude and being forced into isolation. This year's trip was particularly significant because it marked a milestone in the ranch's evolution. The Brennan Ranch Healing Center had just been granted accreditation as an educational institution, allowing them to offer college-level courses in trauma-informed care, sustainable agriculture, and wilderness therapy. Students from universities across the country would now come to learn methods that had been developed through the practical experience of healing hundreds of trauma survivors. Rebecca had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the accreditation ceremony, and she had spent weeks crafting a speech that would honor both the academic rigor of their work and the deeply personal experiences that had informed their methods. But sitting here with her children, looking at the cave that had sheltered her during her darkest period, she realized that the most important audience for her story wasn't academics or policymakers or fellow practitioners. The most important audience was the 2 small people beside her, who would grow up carrying the knowledge that transformation was possible, that love could overcome fear, and that the strongest communities were built by people who had learned to heal themselves. First, tell us about Daddy finding you, Marcus requested, his 4-year-old attention span ready for the next chapter of the story. Rebecca smiled, remembering how different this story sounded when told to children versus when recounted in academic papers or conference presentations. For Eleanor and Marcus, their father was simply Dad, patient, kind, and endlessly creative in his ability to turn ranch work into adventures. They had no reference point for understanding how remarkable it was that Thomas had approached Rebecca's crisis with such wisdom and respect. Daddy knew that someone was living up here, but he didn't know who or why, Rebecca explained. Instead of trying to force me to come out and explain myself, he left supplies and waited for me to decide when I was ready to trust him. This part of the story always led to discussions about consent and boundaries, concepts that Rebecca and Thomas had made central to their children's education. Eleanor and Marcus were growing up understanding that no one had the right to demand access to another person's thoughts, feelings, or physical space, and that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect rather than power or control. The therapeutic value of storytelling had become one of Rebecca's areas of expertise. She had learned that trauma survivors often needed to tell their stories multiple times, in different contexts and to different audiences, before they could fully integrate their experiences and move beyond survival mode into genuine healing. Her children's requests to hear family stories weren't just curiosity, they were participating in an ancient, human tradition of making meaning through narrative. As the afternoon progressed, Rebecca and her children explored the surrounding area, visiting places that held significance in the larger story of the ranch's development. They hiked to the meadow where Thomas had first tracked the mountain lion, now a favorite spot for outdoor wedding ceremonies for former program participants who chose to celebrate their new beginnings in the place where healing had begun. Visited the ridge where the emergency supply cache had been left during that first terrible winter storm, now marked with a small memorial to the power of human kindness in desperate circumstances. They walked along the creek where Rebecca had learned to catch fish with her bare hands, now incorporated into the ranch's primitive skills curriculum. Each location held layers of meaning: personal history for Rebecca, family lore for the children, and pedagogical significance for the educational programs that had grown around these experiences. The landscape itself had become a teaching tool, with specific sites designated for lessons about survival, resilience, community building, and the relationship between humans and the natural environment. The evening campfire was a highlight of these annual trips, a time when the family could disconnect from the constant activity of ranch life and simply be together in the space that had started everything. As darkness fell and the stars became visible above the mountain peaks, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had fled Denver in desperation could never have imagined that her survival story would become the foundation for an institution that helped thousands of people reclaim their own lives. The person who had been convinced that she was fundamentally broken and incapable of good judgment had become someone whose insights were sought by researchers, policymakers, and practitioners around the world. But perhaps most remarkably, the woman who had been terrified of human relationships had created a family and a community built on exactly the kinds of connections she had once believed were impossible: relationships characterized by safety, respect, mutual support, and the understanding that love should enhance rather than diminish individual strength. "Mama," Eleanor said softly as they settled into their sleeping bags, "when I grow up, will I help people like you and Daddy do?" The question touched on something Rebecca and Thomas discussed regularly: how to raise children who understood service to others as a natural part of life without feeling obligated to follow their parents' specific path. They wanted Eleanor and Marcus to understand that they had choices about how to contribute to the world, that their value wasn't dependent on continuing the family business, and that the most important thing they could do was to become fully themselves rather than copies of their parents. "You'll help people in whatever way feels right for you," Rebecca replied. "Maybe you'll work with people who need healing like we do. Maybe you'll become a teacher or a doctor or an artist or something we haven't even thought of yet. The important thing is that you'll know how to take care of yourself and how to build relationships with people who treat you well." Young Marcus had already fallen asleep, curled up in his sleeping bag, with the complete trust that came from never having experienced betrayal or abandonment. Eleanor was fighting sleep, wanting to extend this special time with her mother in the place where the family story had begun. "Tell me about great-grandmother Eleanor," she requested, using the drowsy voice that indicated she would be asleep before the story ended. Rebecca began the familiar tale of her grandmother, the schoolteacher who had raised her after her parents' death, who had taught her that strength and kindness were not contradictory qualities, who had shown her that true safety came from developing capabilities rather than avoiding challenges. The story had become a bridge between generations, connecting Eleanor Rose to the woman she was named for and helping her understand that she was part of a lineage of strong women who had faced difficulties with grace and determination. As her daughter's breathing deepened into sleep, Rebecca lay awake, looking at the stars that had once been her only companions during the long, lonely nights in the cave. The same constellations that had witnessed her desperation and fear were now watching over a family camping trip, a small but profound demonstration of how completely circumstances could change while the fundamental elements of the universe remained constant. The cave that had once represented the furthest edge of human endurance had become a beginning rather than an ending. The isolation that had nearly destroyed her had taught her lessons about self-reliance that she was now passing on to others. The relationship with Thomas that had begun with her inability to trust had evolved into a partnership that demonstrated what was possible when two people committed to growing together rather than controlling each other. Most importantly, the story that had begun with a woman fleeing in terror had become a story about the power of human resilience, the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds, and the understanding that our greatest challenges often contain the seeds of our most important contributions to the world. As Rebecca finally drifted off to sleep, surrounded by her family in the place where her healing had begun, she understood that some circles never fully close, they simply expand to encompass more people, more possibilities, and more hope than anyone could have imagined when the journey first began. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.